Hello and welcome back to the Elephant Lounge. I'm your host Tuesday. I want to thank you so much for joining me. We are on episode 8 of Why They Are Guilty. And if you have not listened to the previous podcasts in this series, I highly recommend you go ahead and do so, as we will be building upon ideas and concepts that I have spoken about before. For this episode, I will be focusing on clear thinking. What is it? What characterizes clear thinking? And then I will go over some strategies to help you become a better thinker, a clear thinker, and I will do a recap, and I'll probably do a little bit of a rant as well. So here we go. What is clear thinking? There are some characteristics that define clear thinking, especially as it applies to true crime, because that's ultimately what the theme of this series is all about. So first and foremost, a person who is open-minded. Now, I'm not a big fan of this term, but I'm defining this as someone who is willing to continually consider the perceptions or views of others as it concerns a story or a narrative, not making instant judgments, and recognizing when you don't know everything, especially if you're not trained or educated in a certain or a particular area of discussion, and just being okay with having uncertainty. A lot of times we always want to know every little aspect or every little answer, but in reality, there are times when we just don't know. And that's okay. And it's perfectly okay to admit when you don't know something. The next characteristic of a clear thinker is someone who can recognize confirmation bias, and they ask themselves continuously, am I considering facts that do not support my bias? So in the example of true crimes, and I've talked about Making a Murderer before, so I'm going to use that as an example for here. If we're not aware of what we're watching as being propaganda, it becomes very easy for us to then go online and look for other people who are going to parrot our bias, and we can find ourselves in these echo chambers. And if we do run across somebody that points out the facts of the trial, for instance, the two trials in this case, these facts will be sometimes dismissed or ignored because those facts in the trials do not fit or confirm our bias. And how do we do that? Well, that leads us into our next characteristic, which is a clear thinking individual notices when they are following the evidence as opposed to leading the evidence. So when a person is leading the evidence, there's a tendency to, as I said, dismiss facts that do not suit their bias, or ignore them, or make excuses for them, like blaming authorities of a conspiracy, and talk about planted evidence or tainted evidence, or even going so far as to blame specific people, other people, for a particular crime. In the case of Making a Murderer, we have everybody but Stephen and Brendan being blamed. And this is done because the facts of the case do not fit the bias that has been solidified in the minds of those who have watched Making a Murderer and believed that it was being truthful or honest. If I am a clear thinking person, I'm going to be able to recognize this. I'm going to be able to think for myself, and I'm going to be able to say, okay, wait a minute, this fact doesn't seem to fit in with what I believe, so how do I compensate for that? Let's think about that. This is something that I need to consider. And rather than dismiss it or start blaming other people or talking about planted evidence, of which there are no pieces of evidence that support any of those other claims, instead of doing that, I'm going to follow the evidence. I'm going to consider all of the evidence. So I've talked about this before, but it's very important that we repeat this, the importance of following evidence, not leading it. So if you find yourself going into the area of conspiracy, or you're blaming other people, or you're talking about planted evidence or things like that, that might be an indication that you've already formed a bias. So we have to recognize it, and then we have to go back and look at our evidence and follow that evidence. And finally, we want to know our environment. Be aware of who you are. Your environment affects how you think and feel about topics. It's up to you to think about things from a different perspective. People from different parts of the country or even the world will likely have different ideas or beliefs that differ from your own. So we need need to understand why a person believes the way they do. And in some cases, you may even learn something from other people, something you never considered. But we have to go out and seek that information online. As I said, when you're in these groups or these support groups of rapists, pedophiles, and murderers, sometimes we develop these echo chambers and we ignore that there's another narrative going on. It's important to know the analysis of others with whom you do not agree with. And this goes back to our discussion on fallacies, the black and white fallacy. We obviously want to avoid that, and we don't want to straw man our opponent. We want to steel man them. So it's up to us to look for the strongest arguments and then go up against those. And if for some reason our arguments don't hold water, then we need to consider something else. Perhaps we are wrong. So what are some ways in which we can develop our mind? What are some strategies we can use? And the first suggestion is conducting a thought experiment. This actually comes from Einstein. So using thought experiments, we can force ourselves to think about ideas logically and remind ourselves what would be required in order for our beliefs to be true. And this can be especially helpful when we're talking about true crime cases. And thought experiments also force us to consider other people's perspectives, but it also forces us to put our own ideas on trial, essentially. This allows us to consider all of the evidence rather than just ignoring some of the evidence. So if we go back to Making a Murderer, let's say, what if someone else did kill Teresa? And what if the evidence was planted? Now we have to really think about what series of events would have to occur in order for this to be remotely true. This is what the thought experiment is about. We really want to hammer down a timeline for this. So you have to have some sort of premeditation in this case. So how did the authorities or whoever killed Teresa, how did they know when she would arrive at the Avery yard? How would anyone know that? We have to work out the actual timeline and narrative, and that includes who are the actual people involved. Is this believable? What is the evidence that supports somebody else was involved? If two people had a conversation about framing Avery, what did that conversation sound like? What did that look like? We want to ask how, who, what, when, where, and why. These are all the important questions that will allow us to look at our story. What is it that we truly believe and why, and what evidence is there to support that? And it won't take long to begin to realize the multiple weaknesses found in alternative narratives. And this comes down to, where is the evidence that anyone else was involved? Ultimately, you need a narrative that fits in with both reality and explains the evidence in a logical way. There is but one narrative that actually fits the facts and reality. And fortunately for us, the juries in Avery and Dacey, they both got it right. Thank goodness. Now, the next method that we're going to talk about is the Socratic method. This is a very popular method taught in law school. So you've probably heard of it before. And these are types of questions that you want to ask yourself, or you can ask others about your theory. So again, you're putting your own theory on trial. Based on the Socratic method, the first types of questions you should be asking are conceptual clarification. These are questions that ask, why does it matter? Why is it significant? How does this relate to the subject at hand? A lot of times with propaganda, they will give you a lot of information that really doesn't have anything to do with the subject matter at hand. So it's up to you to really get down to the meat of things and separate the valuable from the invaluable. And we do that by continuously asking ourselves, okay, here's this fact, but does it really matter? If it's true or if it's not true, does that change anything? And if you find that, whether it's true or whether it's not true, no matter what the answer is, and it doesn't affect anything else about the case or any timeline or anything that you think, then that might be something that you can just ultimately throw out. We want to get to the core. We want to get to the meat of every issue so that we can work out what it is we believe and feel. The second type of questions that are asked in the Socratic method are probing our assumptions. So this is where we ask, what is the evidence that supports your assertions? What can be proven? What leads you to believe this? So this is where you take your narrative and you really break it down. Whenever you see that you're making an assertion or a claim about something, you want to ask yourself, okay, what's the evidence that supports that? Is it supported by other evidence? Or is there something else that's contradicting this? And if it's contradicting it, then we need to dig a little bit further and maybe start over and back up. I've already talked about the scientific method in a previous episode. You can go back and listen to that if you want. But this just gets to this type of questioning just gets to the heart of the matter. It helps you find these weaknesses or inconsistencies when we go about asking these clarifying questions. The third type of questions are probing our rationale, our reasons, and evidence. This is where we ask, how do we know the evidence is valid? A lot of times evidence can be stated as something, but how valid is that evidence? What do you have to back up that evidence? A good prosecuting attorney will present their evidence and then they follow it up with the validity of that evidence. And they show you either expert testimony or they'll show you evidence that supports the previous evidence that was presented, allowing you to see that, something happened before or there's something that correlates with this piece of evidence. And that's why it becomes stronger in the mind. So we want to ask what might be missing. If we're watching a documentary, okay, I believe it was episode 2 or 3 when I went through the example of propaganda, they told us a lot of stuff about Wade and James. There were a lot of claims made. No proof to back up any of those claims, of course, but interestingly enough, there was a lot of stuff missing. They never once tried to explain the behavior of Michael Jackson. They never once presented you with a psychiatrist that explained why a grown man in his sexual prime was continually sleeping with little boys and continually being accused of sexual molestation. We want to know, why is the evidence convincing? What is the reasoning? So these are all about asking yourself questions about how it is you're going about rationalizing your assertions, okay? We want to always dig deep. The fourth types of questions that you want to ask are viewpoints and perspectives. Now, I touched upon this earlier. When it comes to being a clear-thinking individual, you want to always consider the viewpoints and other perspectives, knowing your environment. Who are you? What are your opinions? How do your opinions differ from other people? These types of questions allow you to play devil's advocate. This is the little devil that sits on your shoulder and questions you every step of the way. So no matter what it is you believe in, be that devil's advocate. Be the other side. What questions would you ask if you were someone who didn't believe what you believed? You're coming at it with, how else could you interpret this evidence? Okay, so you have your storyline, you have your frame of reference, what you think happened, but now it's time to think about, well, how else could someone else come along and interpret this same information? This is all about focusing on any bias that you may have toward your own ideas. We want to strip those away by considering how others are interpreting the evidence. Nothing is a better example of this than what's going on right now with the impeachment hearings. There are two sides and there's a set of facts, and quite frankly, I have my own ideas. I'm not going to talk about it, but ultimately both sides see something that happened in their own way. And I don't know who's right or wrong specifically. I really don't, because it's very hard to figure out exactly what happened because there doesn't seem to be any solid evidence. But there is a lot of assertions being made on either side. And I don't think anyone's lying per se, but I think they just firmly have their understanding of what happened, and they're standing firmly in that camp, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, because they just see it differently. And we see this a lot in politics. And sometimes we can see this as it pertains to true crime as well. But it's up to us to ask these questions of ourselves. And the 5 types of questioning are probing implications and consequences. These are asking, how are you arriving at your conclusion? And what are the consequences of this? What else can be affected and how? So in the case of true crime, sometimes ultimately, if we ask ourselves, well, what if we're wrong? What are the consequences of being wrong? Sometimes the consequences of being wrong are the realization that you've been duped. And our pride and our ego are highly invested whenever we're dealing with propaganda, because that's what it appeals to. It appeals to our pride. It appeals to our ego. And we want to feel like we're important. And that's what propaganda does. It appeals to that ego. And to admit that you might be wrong is a blow. Nobody wants to admit that they're duped, but I can assure you I wouldn't be passionate about this topic unless I myself have been duped at one time. We've all been duped. It doesn't make you a bad person, but what it does mean is that you need to arm yourself with more information, like the information that I'm giving in this series. You need to arm yourself with education and information that will help you become better, clear thinking individuals so that you don't get duped in the future. That's what we need to do. It's our responsibility as citizens, as individuals, to be the example for other people. We don't want our loved ones, we don't want our friends or relatives to be duped. We don't want ourselves duped, obviously. What better way than to help people than to help ourselves first and be that example? And finally, questions about the questions. We want to ask ourselves, why are we asking these questions? What are some better questions to ask? How can we ask more productive questions? And this is just essentially going back over the questions that you've already asked and determining, what might be missing. Are there better questions that I can ask? It's all about digging and diving deeper. And so that is the Socratic method. So essentially, the Socratic method is a way to really analyze things and really analyze a situation or a case. It helps you get to the core of formulating your own ideas and thinking for yourself, not just based on what you've been told by some faux-umentary. Now, this might be something that you want to work with on yourself rather than attacking friends or family, because they might not react very well to the Socratic method. But the goal is obviously not to be rude, but it's rather to question the validity of any claim that's being made. And using this method on yourself can really help you gain a much better insight on ideas or concepts that you're interested in. You're really extrapolating everything and breaking it down. And these are the tools that are used by philosophers and in any sort of area, medicine, industry, architecture, any of these areas where things have been built, things have been created. All of these things are tested through thought experiments. Your computer, your phone. The engineers, they ask, what if this falls apart? What if this doesn't work? How can we save this? It's all about thinking what might happen, what could happen, how to improve something. It's all about using these techniques where we're asking questions and we're always testing what it is that we believe in. Clear thinking allows you to achieve an easier path to learning the truth. And that's really what it boils down to. We have to be dedicated to learning the truth and knowing the truth. And while this is very difficult at first, it does become easier as you go along. So make sure you go over this series and go over all of the ideas and concepts that I've been over and really absorb that. Think about that whenever you approach one of these true crime cases. You shouldn't take anyone at their word for something. You need to investigate the claims. And yes, even poor arguments can be truthful, but if you recognize the fallacies and you dig a little bit deeper, you might be able to develop a better argument, a more solid argument. And by going through these thought experiments and using the Socratic method, you will become better aware of where your own weaknesses are. And this is where you can begin to address anything that's missing. If you have something that you need an answer for, well, you know where to start. You now know how to strengthen your argument. So just to recap very quickly, whenever we approach a true crime documentary or any of these cases we read about in the news, we want to approach them as someone who is a clear thinking individual. And again, these concepts and ideas can be applied to any area. I mean, you can apply this to your personal decisions in life. We want to be open-minded. We don't want to rush to judgment. Okay. We want to consider other people's perspectives. We want to recognize, hey, if I don't know something, it's okay. I can be okay with uncertainty. We want to recognize when we have a bias, and that comes about when we are, making excuses or we're blaming authorities, or, anytime that stuff happens, we need to ask ourselves, wait a minute, am I leading the evidence or am I following the evidence? In order to avoid bias, we have to check ourselves and we have to follow the evidence. And then we get into questioning how valid that evidence is. And then finally, we want to be aware of who we are. What environment do we grow up in? And what's the difference between how you feel as an individual versus how someone else feels? And what is their background? What are the differences there? Becoming more aware of who you are and what might be getting in your way, what obstacles might be getting in your way, it'll be necessary for you to really overcome those biases. If you're somebody who's had horrible experiences with the police, you're automatically going to have a bias against the police. That's just how it is. If you don't like the mainstream media, I don't like the mainstream media. This is my own bias. So I don't believe a lot of stuff that the mainstream media says, but I'm aware of that bias. And when I dig deep, sometimes I have to admit, okay, they were right about this. And that's ugly. That's ugly. No one wants to admit that the media is right about something. Not someone like me anyway. But guess what? Sometimes they are right. And just like with the police officers, if you're someone who has a bad experience with the law, you need to realize that not everyone has that experience. A lot of people have great experiences with law enforcement. Not everybody in the law is bad. So you need to get rid of those biases and approach the information with a bit of a clean slate. Okay, and then I talked about thought experiments, and this is really just all about forcing you to really think about what it is you believe. So if you've worked out your timeline and you know exactly what it is you think happened, when and where, now you have to go through and ask yourself, okay, what happened? What had to have taken place in order for what I believe to be true? What actually would have had to have happened? In the case of a lot of these documentaries, if you really break it down, you will realize that any alternative explanation is just simply ridiculous. And then, of course, when we go through the Socratic method, where we're asking ourselves questions and we're sort of putting our ideas on trial, we can really get to the core of the problem, which is that there is no evidence that supports any other alternative theory. All of those other alternative theories are based on feelings alone. Again, with the Socratic method, we have 6 types of questions. We have conceptual clarification, where we're asking questions about the validity or the importance of certain topics or information that is being told to you. Does it matter? So if someone says, Michael Jackson donated money to a hospital, whether he did or didn't has no bearing on the fact that he preyed upon children. It doesn't matter whether he donated to a hospital. So that's something that we can throw out. We don't need to consider that bit of evidence. It has no bearing on the case at hand. We have probing our assumptions. This is where we're asking about what evidence do you have that supports your claim? And then you go on to probing your rationale, your reasons, and the evidence itself. What makes that evidence valid? What is your reasoning and what supports that reasoning? How is that valid? Then we go on to the questioning of viewpoints and perspectives. Again, this is where you're playing devil's advocate. You're just looking at the situation. You're looking at what it is you believe in, and then you have this antagonist next to you asking you, well, what if that didn't happen? Well, what if this happened? Well, what about this? You're just constantly challenging yourself every step of the way so that you can really get to the meat of it. Do you have an answer for it? And if you don't have an answer for it, then maybe it's time you reconsider what it is you believe. And then we have probing, implications, and consequences. This is where we're asking ourselves, how are we arriving at our conclusions? What are the consequences of this? What else can be affected? So if so-and-so is guilty, let's say, how does that affect everything else? Does that turn over everything else, and why? Or is nothing really affected? Because now if this person is guilty, all of a sudden everything makes sense. And then finally, questions about the questions. This is where you're just simply sort of doing a check on yourself. You're just checking what questions you've asked of yourself and asking if they're productive questions and why you ask them. So I really hope this helps anybody out there listening to this. I really hope this helps you sort of get an idea of the importance of being a clear thinking individual. And ultimately, our goal is to desire the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. Right now, we really do live in a society where the politically correct language is being exalted and desired over the truth. Ultimately, most people, not all, but I do believe most people want to be nice and good and all of those things. But that desire is being preyed upon by people who want to utilize that and take advantage of it and lead you down the wrong path. And they do that by lying to you and telling you things that are untruthful. And I'd rather be told the truth and be upset than be told a lie just so I can feel good or make myself feel good about something. I think that's what's happening with a lot of these cases. There's a lot of big money in making true crime documentaries and leading the public down the wrong path. A lot of these people, they want to get rid of the death penalty so the ends justify the means for them. They don't care how they get you there. They just want to get you there. And it's kind of scary when you think about it. They don't care if they lie to you. They don't care if they release somebody who's actually guilty. They just want to get rid of the death penalty. Well, why do you want to get rid of the death penalty? Why don't you argue these things with people instead of trying to manipulate the public? Unfortunately, there's just a lot of people out there that they do want to take advantage of the good character that a lot of us have. And we see it all the time. People see something like Making a Murderer or Central Park 5 and their heartstrings are pulled upon. There's this appeal to people's egos, to people's character, and they want to convince you that this just happened to innocent people and it wasn't their fault and they're just victims of circumstances. And it's a sob story. And a lot of people, they're good people. They want to believe the best in people. They don't want to think that somebody lied to them about all of this stuff, and they run with it. They go with it. And as a consequence, they're being duped. They're being lied to. They're taken advantage of. I think it will come to a point eventually where people are going to wake up to this. I mean, this isn't going to last forever. They're having their day in the sun right now, but soon this is all going to be like a Nigerian, scam where you get the email from the Nigerian prince who wants to send you millions of dollars and send that to your account. He just needs your account number. And there were people that fell for that. There were honest people who fell for that. And it did take a few years for people to finally catch on. And some people knew right away. Some people got it right away, but there were a lot of people that didn't. And it's because they're nice people. They thought they were doing a favor, but there was something in it for them as well. And that's what these focumentaries do. There's something in it for the audience member as well. They get to pat themselves on the back. They get to virtue signal to everyone. Look how loving and tolerant I am. Look how much I care about these victims. There's definitely something to be gained from that. And then you can go online and you can be a part of these groups and you can talk to the family and you can do all these things and be a part of this movement and feel good about yourself because you think you're doing something great and you're standing up for somebody who was wrongfully accused. And some people really need that because they don't really have a lot of anything else going on in their lives, unfortunately. But it's up to us to arm ourselves and protect ourselves with this information. And my whole desire of putting this series together is to really hone in on the concepts and the ideas that will help you become better thinkers, critical thinkers, and to protect yourself with the information that you need to no longer be a victim of this propaganda. It's just a little bit more sophisticated. It's the same thing as the Nigerian scam. It's just more sophisticated because it's got cameras and lights, and it's got some news people or some, professional looking people in suits telling you lies. Snake oil salesmen have been around since the dawn of time. They started selling men elixirs for their hair to grow their hair back. There's been a number of these things all throughout the years in all different cultures. I mean, nobody's immune from this. It's just another way to sell you something and to prey upon you. Only the consequences for this are a little bit greater because it deals with our justice system. Do we have a perfect justice system? No, we don't have a perfect justice system, but this is not the way to fix it. These documentaries supporting these rapists, murderers, and pedophiles are not the way to fix it. We have to start locally, but more importantly, we have to start with ourselves. We have to start with ourselves. We have to use the same concepts and ideas that were utilized by the greatest minds of our world. Socrates, Aristotle, Newton, Einstein, all of these men who helped develop all of the things that we know. They're behind everything that we have, everything that we cherish. These are the ways, using the scientific method. This is how we've advanced. Are mistakes going to be made? Sure, of course they're going to be made. That's okay. It's not the end of the world. By having the appeals in our justice system, by having these things, these allow for the checks and balances that are needed. And ultimately, we also have to remember that doubt in our system, it requires reasonable doubt. Not all doubt is reasonable. Anybody can have doubt about anything. I can have doubt about gravity. I can have doubt about anything I want. I can have doubt about the sun existing, but it doesn't mean that doubt is reasonable. And by going over the information that I've gone over in this series, it will help you determine whether the doubt you have is reasonable. Go over your thought experiment. Think about what it is that would have had to have happened in order for what it is you to believe is true. What are the things that would have had to have occurred? Is it reasonable? Is it plausible? Is there evidence for it? If there's no evidence for it, then it's time to go back to the drawing table. And I will be back.